two events are independent, we'll say that the events A and B are independent if A happening does not affect the probability of B happening. If A happening makes B more likely or less likely, then they're dependent, not independent. Here are some examples of independent events. Suppose I flip a coin and I roll a die. Whatever I get on the coin doesn't affect the probability of what I get on the die. So if I flip a heads, it doesn't make getting a 6 more or less likely. If I flip two coins, that's also independent. Getting a heads on the first one doesn't make getting a heads on the second one any more or any less likely. Dependent events are events where one event's happening makes the other event more or less likely. So, for example, suppose event A is that it's cold, event B is that it's snowing. If it's cold, it's more likely to be snowing. Not guaranteed, just more likely. So we say that A in that situation is being cold and B in this situation snowing are dependent events because one thing makes the other thing, in this case, more likely. Uh, they can also make things less likely. Suppose you roll a die one time. Getting a 3 on the die makes getting a 4 much less likely. In fact, it makes it impossible. If you get a 3 when you roll a die, you didn't get a 4. I mean, obviously, you can only get one number at a time. So getting a 3 on a given die and getting a 4 on that same die on the same roll, those are dependent events, not independent events. If two events are independent, then things work out nicely because you can find the probability that both happen by just multiplying the probabilities. So let's do an example. Let's say I have a fair coin, and that means I have a probability of 1/2 of getting a heads. And let's say I have a fair die, and let's say I want to think about getting a 3 on the die. That means I have a 1 in 6. Let's fix that up a little bit. 1 in 6 chance of getting a 3 on the die. Now somebody says, well, what's the chance of getting a heads on the coin and getting a 3 on the die? It's real simple. We're just going to multiply these two things together, and the probability is 1/12. Independent events are fantastic to work with. Dependent events, you can work with them. There's ways to work with them, but it's not going to be as easy. So before you go about multiplying probabilities like this, you must make sure that the events are actually independent. In some of these worksheets, we're going to explore what makes something independent versus dependent. But before you multiply probabilities, you have to be 100% certain that they're independent events, which means that the probability of one makes that one event happening makes the second event no more likely and no less likely.